Hello and welcome to this quick little overview on A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams. Hopefully this will help you get ready for your research paper, give you a quick little overview of the play itself, some background, and get into some of the topics that you'll have for your research paper to pick from. Basically, this is to help set you up for annotating and what to look for as you're reading. So just a quick overview, Tennessee Williams was an American playwright who wrote mostly during the 1950s and 1960s, and he died in the 1980s. He was openly gay for most of his life, and there's lots of speculation that came out in some of his characters, but we won't get into that today. That's another lecture in and of itself. Historical context, as I said, this play was written in the 1950s, and we're reading about, Stanley Kowalski, who was abusive, and that wasn't uncommon during the time, but it wasn't really something that people wrote about. I don't want to give away the ending because I know we haven't gotten there yet, but there are some other things that happened throughout the story that were considered scandalous, which played into the reception of the play as well. The story is taking place in New Orleans during a lot of Reconstruction. It's post-Civil War by quite a few years, but the South is still holding on to that loss. And we see a battle of Old South versus New South in the story, Stanley Kowalski representing that New South of immigration, rough around the edges, working class, and that Old South with Blanche, who is still struggling to survive, quite literally, in this play. And you'll see that struggle come out in a few scenes later on, but her family has pretty much abandoned her, either literally by leaving like Stella or through death. So she's really the last of a dying breed, so to speak. So the play itself was not initially too well received because of some of the things that happened later on, but it is still studied today. It's considered one of his best plays. Probably that and, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, The Glass Menagerie. This is my personal favorite of his. It also happens to be in your book. There's a lot going on, but it was not initially well received. They also made a film version of it with Marlon Brando and Vivian Leigh, who played the original Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. So if you're interested in kind of watching it play out, I do recommend watching some scenes from that film. I'll post whatever I can to Canvas as well. It's just a brief introduction of research paper topics. The next couple of slides are going to go into each of the 3 available topics. So for your research paper, you're going to pick one of those topics. The articles are already there for you, so you don't have to go into the databases. You don't have to find additional articles. You do have to use all of the articles associated with your topic, as well as the play itself. So I'm going to go over each of these just so you know what to look for. Hopefully one of these is interesting for you and you pursue it further. So topic number 1 is my personal favorite because this is what I studied in graduate school, is traumatic memory and how humans, in literature specifically I studied, but how humans deal with trauma and cope with trauma, or in some cases don't deal with it or don't cope with it. So we look at Blanche's memory, which probably isn't too obvious yet in the first 3 scenes, but it will become more obvious that's something she struggles with as you read the rest of the play. So pay attention to her memories and how she recounts her memories, what triggers her memories, things like that. Again, we don't really know too much about her in this area yet, but start to look for ways in which Blanche was traumatized. We do learn about her losing, a lot of her family members throughout, before she arrived at Stella and Stanley's house. So that's one way in which she was traumatized, and just pay attention to how she deals with that. One of the articles you're going to read is my favorite trauma theorist is Dominic LaCapra, and he wrote a book called Writing History, Writing Trauma, and that was basically the baseline for my entire master's thesis. And he has these 2 concepts of acting out a trauma versus working through the trauma. Acting out a trauma is basically when someone does not cope with it, doesn't deal with it, and they act it out either physically and literally, or through things like flashbacks, nightmares, visions. They can't really move past it. Whereas working through is when someone's able to give a narrative context to their trauma. So they're able to talk about it or write about it and, again, give it that narrative context. And they're able to move past it through verbalizing it, again, either in written or spoken word. So those are some things to look for. Again, especially, when Blanche talks about things that have happened to her, really pay attention to how she reacts, how she's telling those stories. Who is she telling them to? What triggered her to tell these stories? Second topic is Streetcar as tragedy. And I'm thinking of this in the way of a Greek tragedy. You probably read them in high school. Things like Oedipus. We have the tragic hero or the tragic heroine. We have a hero's journey. So that's one way to read this story. And if you choose this, I want you to analyze it through Aristotle's theory of tragedy. And this is just a quick clip of what he claims is tragedy. So the tragic hero, in this case, it would be Blanche Dubois. I know you may not like her in the first couple of scenes, but I promise you'll feel a little differently about her as you read. But his theory of tragedy says that tragic hero is not necessarily a villain or a virtuous person. They're kind of this in limbo figure. They're between the two extremes. So the tragic hero is not, your typical Hercules type of hero. A man, or in this case, a woman, who is not eminently good and just, yet whose misfortune is brought about not by vice or depravity, but by some error or frailty. And that's where we get the term hamartia. So it's not really a tragic flaw. It's some kind of error in fate or destiny or what have you. All right, so that would be topic number 2. Lastly is topic number 3, and that's the role of illusion and fantasy. We may have seen a little bit of this in the first couple of scenes, but you want to think about how Blanche deals with reality, or lack thereof. She really doesn't deal with reality too much. She kind of avoids reality because reality has been very painful for her. So it does tie a little bit to topic number 1, but you're really going to focus not on the trauma, but on how Blanche's world is a fantasy and ultimately what happens to destroy that. Again, no spoilers here. I want you to read all the way to the end and find out what happens. So thinking about in what ways does she live in a fantasy or try to keep up this fantasy life that she has? In what ways does she create illusions for other people? You'll see a lot of focus on her age and how she presents herself. She talks a lot about being nervous, so pay attention to those types of things. And then what does this overall theme of realism versus fantasy mean for the story's theme and plot? So, what is the story saying about realism and fantasy? What's the comment on realism here that Tennessee Williams might be saying? Make sure you watch that video on Williams. Again, a lot of it might help put some of the story into context for you. Make sure you're looking at all of the PowerPoints and all of the resources available. It's a great play. Really take your time to read it. I know we don't have, as much time to work on this, but you are writing your paper on it. So hopefully one of these topics struck you as interesting, and you can start to really annotate focusing on that research paper rather than just annotating in general. This should help give you a focus, and that was my intent with this video. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments or send me an email. My plan is to do a quick YouTube live of questions next week, so hopefully that will pan out. So any questions you have about the topics or the story itself, let me know. Send me an email, drop it in the comments, and I hope to hear from you all soon. Stay healthy.